In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll give you some tips and tricks for when you need to cast on new stitches in the middle of a project. You can jump directly to a specific section of the video using the chapter links in the video timeline. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks today for situations in which you need to cast on additional stitches in the middle of your project. So you've already cast on for your project, you've worked on it for quite a while, and now you are being told that you need to cast on additional stitches. Now this could happen in a couple of different situations. One would be if you are knitting flat and you are going to need to cast on stitches either on one side of the fabric or the other. You might have to do on both, but the idea is that you're making this fabric wider, and so you're extending the edge out this way or out this way. That's one situation. Another situation is one where you could be working flat or you could be working in the round. And so rather than casting on and extending an edge out this way, you are casting on somewhere in the middle of the row or in the middle of the round. So the first thing to keep in mind is that when you are casting on in a situation like this, you have to select a cast on method that only requires one strand of yarn. So if you're like me and you like to use the long tail cast on, or maybe you use the Old Norwegian or Twisted German cast on, those require 2 strands of yarn, and you can certainly use those to begin your project. But if you have to cast on stitches later, you need to use just 1 strand. And so the strand of yarn you're going to use is the yarn that is attached to the needle. It's the working yarn. There are 3 really common 1-strand methods of casting on. One of them is the E-wrap or backwards loop cast on. Another is called knitting on, and then the third would be the cable cast on. So those are the 3 that are most commonly used. So one of the other requirements of casting on in the middle of a project is that the new stitches are going to appear on the needle that the working yarn is attached to. So they're going to appear on the needle next to the existing stitches, and the working yarn will be always closest to the tip. The backwards loop cast on can be done so that you are putting new stitches on the left-hand needle. I can do that right now. I can do a backwards loop like that. I can put new stitches on the left-hand needle, but I can also do it on the right-hand needle. So I can add stitches using the backwards loop on either needle. So that is a really versatile cast-on method. The problem is that it's just loops wrapped around the needle, and some people have a hard time controlling the tension when they go to work those stitches on the next row or the next round. So I do have a tips and tricks video on this specific cast-on method and to help you control the tension with that. But this is versatile in that stitches can be added to the right-hand needle or to the left-hand needle. The other 2 cast-on methods, knitting on and the cable cast-on, are always added to the left-hand needle. It can only be used when the working yarn is hanging from the left-hand needle. So if you are working flat, your pattern might tell you to cast on additional stitches at the end of a row. And that would mean that all of the stitches are on one needle, you've just completed all of them, and this needle is in your right hand, the working yarn is hanging from the right needle, and you were supposed to cast on additional stitches right now. So if I add stitches right now using the backward loop, after I finished this row, the next thing I do is I turn my work as I would do when I work flat, and then I work this row. Well, the first thing that I have to do is work across all of those stitches that I just cast on, and then I can work the established stitches. But sometimes a pattern will tell you to cast on at the beginning of a row. And so you've completed this row. Now you've finished this row. That's the end of the row. And now you turn the work, and now you are ready to start the row. And so in order to add stitches to the beginning of the row, you would be adding them to this left-hand needle. And you really have any choice of cast on that you want to use. You can do the backwards loop cast on again if you want, or you could use knitting on or the cable cast on. So if you do knitting on, so I've added a few stitches by knitting on. Now I want to work the entire row. The first thing I have to do is work across those newly cast on stitches. So the tip for casting on at the beginning of a row or end of a row is that it's the same thing. So you are casting on stitches between the existing stitches and the tip of the needle. You can choose any method you like, and you just need to hold the needle in the hand that is going to make that cast on work. So if you want to do if you want to hold the needle in your right hand, you can do a backwards loop. But if you want to do knitting on, you hold this in your left hand and you cast on those stitches. So the next tip is if you need to cast on stitches in the middle of a row or round. So one reason you might want to do that is if you've been making horizontal slits like a buttonhole, you might have bound off some stitches on one row or one round, and then on the next row you have to cast on stitches to replace the ones that you have bound off. So that's one situation in which you might need to cast on in the middle of a row or the middle of a round. Another situation is when you are doing something like mittens or a top-down raglan sweater where you've been increasing for either the thumb gusset or you're increasing for the sleeves, and you need to take a bunch of stitches off the needle and put them on waste yarn. So in this situation, you'd be taking a lot of stitches off the needles, and you need to cast on a few stitches, usually not as many as you are taking off. You might be taking off an entire, sleeve circumference worth of stitches, but only casting on a couple of inches. Or you might be taking a whole thumb's worth of stitches off the needles and only casting on a couple of stitches more. So we've taken these stitches off the needle, and now we need to cast some stitches on. Well, in this situation, when you are working in the round or you are working in the middle of a row, when you get to the point where you need to cast on, that working yarn is hanging from the right hand needle. So once again, you can use a method of casting on that will place stitches on the right hand needle. So you could use that backwards loop method of casting on if you wanted. But if you prefer to use the cable cast on or knitting on, what you would do is you would turn the work so that the back side is facing you. And then you would do your cable cast on or your knitting on onto the needles. Let's do 3 stitches. And then when you're done, you just turn the work back again. And then continue and finish the rest of the row or the rest of the round. In this video, I demonstrated how to approach casting on stitches at the beginning, middle, or end of a row, and mentioned 3 common cast-on methods that are often used in these scenarios. These cast-on methods are not your only options. There are literally dozens of cast-on methods, and there are always multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint in knitting. If you prefer a different single strand cast on method, try it out on a swatch and see if it will work for your project. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.